Go ahead, Bill.
Hey everyone. It's nice to connect. I know it's been a long time since we've seen each other in person, but this is a great way to at least caught up. And thanks, Gary, for pulling this together. It was a great idea. I know I've enjoyed a lot of the talks and I've learned a lot. So first, I'm just going to follow the format that everybody else has been following and tell you just a little bit about fisheries dependent investigations and our special fisheries research program. And then I'm going to get into a little bit of the striped bass acoustic telemetry that we've been working on for the past several years, really, and then really what we're doing right now. So FDI and special fisheries research is underneath Mike Armstrong, assistant director. Gary is our program lead, and underneath that there's age and growth, us, and then stock assessment and research specialist, which is really Micah Dean. He's a one-man team there. And then under me are a couple employees, Brad Schondelmeyer and Nicole Ward. And then I put in Joe Holbash. Typically, we would have a third person. In the past, we've had seasonals, technicians, contract, or even FTEs. Now, the two FTEs are just Brad and Nicole. But I put Joe in because he's been with us for about a year and a half. He just recently left to get his master's. It's a great opportunity for him. I wish him all the best. But he was really a big part of the striped bass work that I'm about to talk about. So first, fisheries dependent investigations. Our role is to collect and manage commercial fisheries information from state and federal fisheries to support research management and stock assessment. So essentially, this is our state sea sampling and port sampling program. Recently, some of the projects that we've been working on is the characterization of the mass squid fishery. This winter, Brad Schondemeyer and I took an in-depth look at the squid fishery that's conducted off of Nantucket Sound, Vineyard Sound, and then put that into a report to inform policy, essentially. Nicole Ward supports Bob Glenn, Tracy Pugh's group by lobster catch sampling in the commercial fishery. She also does a lot of striped bass market sampling, collecting age samples from the commercial fishery. We all kind of chip in and do biological sampling for Menhaden. That's commercial and recreational sampling. Recently, past couple of years, when Nick Buchan used to work with us, really working closely with Micah Dean. Most of you know, we've had the industry-based survey for Gulf Maine Cod 2. That was the second one. The first one was 2003, 2007 that I did. And then Brad has been really like our herring specialist, running research through the research set-aside program and conducting the river herring bycatch avoidance program, working closely with the midwater trawl fishery. So I think over the last 10 years or so, a lot of our state fisheries, commercial fisheries, have started to dwindle, unfortunately, and get smaller. The federal government observer program has stepped in and done more sampling than they traditionally used to do. And that really allowed us to kind of capitalize off some of our strengths and really venture more into we call special fisheries research. And with that, we conduct and support collaborative fisheries independent research. Some of the collaborators have been New England Aquarium, UMass Dartmouth, UMass Amherst, Rutgers, GMRI, GMGI. So there's many others. And we do this research typically to support management, improve stock assessments, and to contribute just to the overall general body of science for individual species. So for example, some of the programs we've recently done, we are currently actually still doing our bycatch avoidance system for Gulf of Maine cod in the haddock recreational fishery. Essentially, we used information from the cod IBS2. Micah Dean published some really tremendous informative maps that we've then turned around and distributed back to the public through tackle shops, and through shows that inform recreational anglers where they can go and they can target cod or rather target haddock and not catch cod, so avoid cod. We've done several studies on striped bass migration, both longitudinal and coastal migrations. And then we've done a series of post-release mortality studies. So post-release meaning once you catch the fish and you let it go, does it live or not, or what proportion of those live? So post-release mortality studies for several ground fish, cod, haddock, and cusk. So a couple weeks ago, Ben gave a really good talk about striped bass and a lot of the work that he's doing for his dissertation. And he did touch on some of this work that we've done that we've already published back in 2014. It really started back in 2008. I think we started tagging striped bass, and we published 2 studies, and those were the movements of striped bass between the EEZ or federal waters and Massachusetts state waters, and then movement patterns and stock composition adult striped bass in Massachusetts and coastal waters. And so he, as he said, he's using really the new technology that's out there in genetics. He's going to really expand and improve, especially that latter paper that we published. And so, but that's kind of like what we've done up to this point. And now this is next, and really the rest of the talk is going to be what we're doing right now, what I did last week, and really what I was doing all last summer, or all of us. This body of research is being done with Micah Dean, Ben Gahagan, Gary Nelson, Mike Armstrong, with support from Brad and Nicole and FDI. So I don't need to say this, but to kind of set the stage here, we all know striped bass is the #1 recreationally targeted species in Massachusetts. 2019, we sold 193,000 permits to saltwater fishing permits, and anglers caught an estimated 5.5 million, say, striped bass. Of that, about 200,000 roughly were harvested. And so if you were to take Paul Diodati, the former director's post-release mortality rate estimate for striped bass and do the math, that's a removal of almost 500,000 fish. So that's a large number. And now take that and then consider that in the 2017 stock assessment, spawning stock biomass, SSB, was decreased to 151 million pounds. So that touched on some thresholds that, yeah, there's a problem. It's not that the stock has collapsed and the sky is falling, but it required managers of the various states to decrease mortality by 18%. So to do that, Massachusetts, we enacted a new slot limit of 1 fish at 28 inches up to 35 inches. We also proactively mandated the use of circle hooks in the striped bass fishery. So why circle hooks? So circle hooks have been widely studied in several different fisheries. Offshore billfish fisheries use them. Those are primarily catch and release fisheries. The Billfish Foundation has gone out and basically endorsed certain hook styles. When you go to a tackle shop and you buy a circle hook for billfish, it'll actually have a stamp on it saying this is approved by the Billfish Foundation. But they've also been mandated on the federal level. So in the shark fishery, so if you're recreational shark fishing right now, you're mandated to use circle hooks. Certain states have mandated them. Florida have used them in any reef fisheries, so groupers, snappers, amberjacks, they're required. And looking at it, we felt like the state felt like it was a great application in the striped bass fishery. So striped bass, when they feed, rather than like a ground fish that will hover over the bait, pick it up and swim away, bass will come up and open up their mouth and just inhale the bait. A way a circle hook works is that when it goes in, it will hook on a leading edge, and that's what it grabs onto. So typically when you pull a circle hook out of the back of the throat of a striped bass mouth, it usually hooks up on the outer side in the lip or in the hinge, or at least in theory, that's how it's supposed to work. And that's why we thought it would be a great application. And when we looked at the literature, we noticed that there was a real paucity of information on striped bass, post-release mortality work, and circle hook work more, especially in in salt waters. There's been some in fresh waters, but they didn't necessarily translate well to what's going on here in salt waters. So using that, based on that, we formulated a study with the goal to estimate the conservation benefit using circle hooks in the Massachusetts striped bass fishery. So this was a natural fit for us based on a lot of the past work that we've done. So most of you know how acoustic telemetry works, and you've seen our talks and Greg Scomel's stuff. But basically you have a transmitter here, which we would call a tag, and then we use receivers, and receivers are set in an array. So here's an example of an array that was out on Southern Jeffries a few years ago. And so when the tag or the swims through the array, it pings to these receivers, and you get a unique ID and sensor information, sort of like a car driving through an easy bass toll. And so how we use that to determine mortality in this study, we looked at the horizontal movements, so from receiver to receiver, as it swam through and swam out of the array. We knew that also along with the vertical movements. So this was depth profiles. We could see that this was an active fish swimming around. And so it was very easy to determine that this fish survived. Conversely, this fish was released inside the array. It traveled only a short distance. And then really when you looked at the depth profiles, essentially just flat lines. And so that was a clear cut fish that didn't make it. So that was easy enough. However, this is a little, it's not older technology, but it's advanced sense. And it was at times difficult to determine mortality, typically because we didn't have enough data points. It left the array too quickly or whatnot. So now the new, some of the newer tags are out, are accelerometers. And so this is what we used. And this is how they work. So this is an accelerometer, and it's produced by Vemco or in Innovacy. And they measure movement on 3 axes, and then it averages those together to give you a meter per second square calculation. They also allow you to turn off one of the access points and just use like an XY axis. And that is used for tailbeat frequency. And that's what we used. So you take the tag and you surgically implant it or externally attach it. We externally attached it to the fish, and then it records these movements. And so here's an example. This is sensor data that I downloaded from a receiver. And you can see the meters per second square measurements, and they vary. And so this fish is putting out this measurement. And if you were to plot it, meters per second squared over time, it's kind of what you expect. You can see pick up the fish swimming. There's some spikes, typically either evading predators or feeding activities. So this is a very clear-cut way to look at to determine if this fish is alive or not. This is a fish that died after we tagged it. So again, here is the sensor information. And if you follow it down, you can see it slows down and then boom, it flatlines. So this measurement of 0.01922 is very indicative. This is a dead fish. And again, if you were to plot it, you can see as soon as we tagged it, there was some movement, it slowed down, and then there you go. That's a dead fish. So so it was a very easy way to determine mortality on the majority of the fish, and I'll get to that in a second. So in the study, we were looking at a couple different types of hooks. We looked at J hook, which essentially was our control, and then the circle hook. It was challenging this spring to come up with the appropriate tackle type just because of COVID. It was hard to communicate with the public and people and tackle shops. Most of them, a lot of them were shut down. But through a number of conversations that I had and really a bunch of input I got from tackle shops, you know, what's the most popular hook they sell, so not whatnot. We determined that the Gamakatsu A-dot inline circle was one of the most commonly used hooks in the fishery. And then for the J hook, the control, we use the Gamakatsu 6.0. So in the state right now, you're required to use a circle hook if you're using natural baits. For striped bass, we did the same thing. And we used either live or dead herring, mackerel, or menhaden, really what was available to us on that day. 90% of the time, it was probably mackerel. Other data elements that we collected were temperature, angler skill level, fight time, handling time, and release time. In addition, when we caught the fish, we assigned it a condition score that was based on the hook location and the trauma to the fish. So, for example, a condition 1 would be a fish that was hooked in the lip, hinged. Here's an example of one using a circle hook. Little damage, no trauma, you let it go, swims away fine, very vigorous. A 2 would be one that was hooked a little bit deeper in the mouth, uh, roof of the mouth, tongue, maybe the back of the mouth, a little bit more blood, but no damage to the gills, no damage to the esophagus, and certainly not to the stomach or anything like that. A 3, now we're getting to the point where, it's pretty beat up, and we saw it a lot. And typically to be hooked in the gills, deep hook stomach, and there'd be moderate to or heavy bleeding. Um, and then a 4 is a dead fish, one that was unresponsive after several minutes while on deck and removing the hook. You release it, either it floats away or it immediately sinks. And that's an example of a fish that was about to be a 4, probably. So, you guys have seen some of these talks before. Our array was very similar to what we've done in the past. We've used our standard mooring setup with just vertical lines and buoys, or we used an ATON, an aid to navigation, and we hung receivers off of those. We tried to just carpet the Salem Beverly Sound area. We had over 30 receivers. And then we put them in a way so we had a gate to the east and southern boundary of the sound. And then we just tried to fill in the best we can in areas where either there were ATONs and we could capitalize off of hanging receivers off of those. That seems to work very well for us. We don't hardly ever lose a receiver if we put one on an ATON. And then in areas where we believe where we were going to be tagging and fishing. The rings that you see in this illustration is the theoretical range. So in acoustic telemetry, ambient noise reduces range, and usually the number one source for that is wind. Maybe the second, maybe heavy rain, but wind is the number one. So theoretically, at say 9 knots of wind, our range we estimated to be about 590 meters. That's the black ring. And then if it breezed up, we had a lot of southerlies in the summer. I mean, I know you guys at Buzz Bay get plenty of those too. 22 knots. We have a decreased range of about 455 meters estimated. In addition to that, we maintained our historic array that we have been doing for years now, and those are essentially gates that are off of Cape Ann. We had 14 receivers out there. That's the line that goes out about 9 miles offshore. We have the Peaked Hill array, which is a line that goes out to the state waters, and then the Cape Cod Canal array, which is basically seals off both the east and the west ends of the canal. Last summer we conducted 20 tagging trips. We caught roughly 20 fish a trip. So we we caught over 400 bass, and we tagged 176 of them. The size range was from 46 centimeters up to 115 centimeters, with really the weighted average was around 63 centimeters. And that was, as expected. We would have liked to tag a wider range of sizes and more fish, but in 2015, 2016, those are two very strong year classes. There was a lot of recruitment to the fishery, and really it's indicative of what we saw up and down Massachusetts coast and really the whole stock boundary. We did divide the sizes and tried to distribute the tags around different size bins. So we tagged up to 28 inches. Then we tried to targeted the slot, which was 28 inches up to 35 inches, not including, and then anything 35 inches and bigger. We tagged the months of June, July, August, and a couple in September. Actually, looking at the raw data right now, it seems like some of the fish in June didn't really hang around long. We detected them and we got good data from them, but they didn't stay around. They were still headed up to the north, not too surprisingly. And we try to spread it out as even as possible, just being as opportunistic too. I mean, as you know, sometimes fishing, you don't know what you're going to get. So we distributed our tags. 84 went into fish caught with circle hooks, and the remaining 92 went into J hooks. So preliminary results. I mean, I just downloaded a receiver last week, and so we're still pulling a lot of this stuff together. We haven't had even the opportunity to do any formal analysis, but there were some pretty interesting observations that I had just looking through the raw data. First of all, I was relieved to see that the array worked. It worked well. We had, I think, roughly 300,000 detections from bass that we tagged in the Beverly Salem array. And then just on the other arrays, including the gates that I just mentioned, we had over 500,000 detections. And that does not include all what we call co-op detections. So the co-op detections are like all those receivers that Greg Scommel has out. The beauty of this technology that we're using is that just because we put a tag on our fish and we're using it with our receivers, it doesn't mean like if Greg picks up our fish, he's going to detect it and then he'll be able to share that information with us. And we have a network of receivers all the way down to the Chesapeake, where when our fish migrate south in the fall, we'll pick them up the whole way down and then the whole way back next spring. The residence time, I mean, we had everything from one event that was a minute or two and then the fish left. Later, some of those were detected and up off of Cape Ann and other areas, up to some fish just lived there for the summer, 127 days. Average is, I put that in there as 44 days, but that doesn't include the ones that were there and then left. And then on their migratory south pattern, we picked them up again. So that would be teased out. But the bottom line is the array worked, and we did a really good job picking up fish on our receivers. The individual tagged fish detected, we tagged, out of the ones that we tagged in Beverly Salem, we detected 156 of the fish. So there were some missing in the array that we did not detect. Touch on that in a second. The majority of them, a lot of them went north. At one point, they made a transit up to Cape Ann and probably beyond. And then on the southern migration, as they started to head south, 125 were picked up going through the canal, 76 through Peaked Hill. And you look, it's like, well, those numbers don't jive. Sometimes one fish could have hit all of those arrays. It could have hit all Cape Ann, Cape Cod Canal. And so I haven't been able to tease any of that out. But again, if the fish was in Massachusetts waters, which majority of them were, we picked them up. So looking at the raw data right off the top, 14 confirmed dead. We have 19 that were unknown, essentially too few detections right now to really determine. Need to go back and see, hopefully they show up on some of Greg's receivers. We should be able to tease out majority of those. And then the 14 missing. So those are kind of a big question mark. But if you looked at the array, you'll notice that there were some holes. So these areas. So if we did tag a fish and it died immediately and sank to the bottom, it's possible that we didn't pick it up in our array and it's still there. And we have the ability to go back now. We have what they call the VR100. It's basically a mobile receiver that goes out and can look for tags. People use it for live tracking and stuff like that. We're going to go back and look for some of these missing tags. So, I mean, I threw this in here. Don't take this to into the bank, but it does look like, just based on what we have, we have back of envelope estimate of a post-release mortality rate of anywhere from 8 to maybe 16%, which isn't too surprising. If you were to take Diodati's estimate and apply it, we're right in that range. So it's not like groundbreaking at this point. Another really interesting thing was how long it took them to die. So this is a plot that Ben Gagan did in R. It came out pretty cool on the y-axis. These are all the individual fish that we tagged, and then on the x-axis we have time. And one of the things you'll notice if you look at it, sure, some of these fish, as soon as we released them, they died, but a lot of these took multiple days um, before they died. And that is really a strength to what we did, I think, in using this technology. So historically, in some of the other studies, in these post-release mortality studies, people would catch a fish and they'd put it in a cage and they would sink it. Well, there's an added bias to that. And this, we're catching the fish and releasing it back into its natural environment. And so we can study it over a longer period of time. I think that we're optimistic that at least out to about 2 weeks, and this is what we've done in other post-release mortality studies with groundfish. We're looking at the mortality rate over a 2-week period. So this is going to be, when it's done, it should be a very robust estimate and probably more realistic of what's going on. So, I mean, the big question is, well, did it work? Does circle hooks work? And it's, at this point, it's inconclusive. We've got 23 fish out there still that we need to determine the fate of. There's definitely promise, and there's gonna be some opportunity for circle hooks to really decrease, I think, mortality. However, they're also not perfect. If you've ever fished for bass or any species and you've used circle hooks, lots of times you'll see they don't always hook in the lip or in the hinge. And we definitely saw that in this study. But there aren't, this isn't the only factor that contributes to mortality either. It could be the size of the hook. Manufacturers, like if you get an Ado Gamakatsu versus an owner or an Eagle Claw, they're all different. There's no standard in circle hooks. And so this is something that is worth investigating and looking at. Um, Handling practices, there's a big difference. If you've caught a lot of bass and you deep hook it with a circle hook, if you know how to get it out, you can get it out quick and get it back pretty unharmed. But if you don't know how to get these things out and the best way to do it, you can cause a lot of damage, a lot of trauma to the fish, and it's held out of the water longer. So this is something that's going to contribute to mortality. And then we still feel that water temperature now in this study might be a little bit harder to tease out. We're going to look at it. We collected all the information. We have temperature profiles of the water column. And this is all data that we collected. So we will be looking at this in detail. But I think in the end, one of the things that's going to come out of this is that education is going to be paramount. And it's no different than what we've been doing, but we do need to sell this. We're going to have to sell this. Handling practices, as I mentioned, better technique. If you get an angler out there and you give them a circle hook, they might have a hard time catching fish and they're going to think like, wow, these don't work as good. Why? I don't want to use these. But if you instruct them, say you're using a large bait like a menhaden, you know, bridling, show them how to bridle a hook to a menhaden, you're going to not only get a better hook placement, you're going to have a better hookup ratio. So these are things that whether we do through our social media, you know, or if we work with fishing clubs or other organizations, associations, tackle shops, this is the word that I think this is where we're going to be headed with this, and we're going to try to be getting that out there. And then, you know, reduce fish stress, get that out there too. It's like the quicker you get it off the hook, get it better in the water, minimize lifting out of the water. These are all things that we've been preaching already, but I think that doing this work, it just really reinforces that, how important that is. And so moving forward, year two this summer, looking at this raw data, we've only had one meeting since, but we've already identified the need to look at other hook styles. We are going to be sending out a survey via social media and working with other fishing groups, polling them essentially, what is the preferred hook? What is your preferred circle hook for targeting striped bass? I anticipate we'll get a top 3, top 4 list, and then we'll be able to compare that to what we used. I'm sure our hook will be in that top list, and we're going to try and find an alternative hook and see if we see any different results. Can we improve on what we've already done and get that out there to the public? And the other thing is we're doing this another year to increase our observations. So if we tag 100 fish and we only have an 8% mortality rate, that's only 8 fish that we're basing a lot on. So we really need to pump that up. We're going to bump that up. Um, we're going to kill a few more fish, but we're also going to get a lot more observations that will really enhance our work and give us a more robust post-release mortality rate. Um, and really, I think the other take home from one of these things that we're going to be doing and why we're doing it next year is terminal tackle is going to be very important to the striped bass fishery. If you look at the mortality rates, the SSB is dipped. We've reached the threshold where we need to start rebuilding. And that's difficult to do. We have so many recreational anglers, and striped bass is so popular that the recreational sector puts a lot of unintentional mortality on the fish and on the stock. And rolling closures, ground fisheries, that's not going to work for straight bass. Area closures, timeout closures, none of this is, because people are going to go fishing. They're going to go out and be like, oh, I was fishing for black sea bass or bluefish, and they're going to be catching striped bass. So we need to come up with another way to decrease mortality, and that's why terminal tackle and research in the terminal tackle area is going to be important. It's not unlike what Mike Pohl does and David Chosid with commercial fishing when they're looking at conservation engineering and modifying trawl nets. I think I view this anyways is a similar application just in the recreational fishery. And then finally, touch on the bigger picture for us. I've talked a lot about post-release mortality, but it's our hope and our intention over the next several years to look at the Diodati 1996 mortality rate and improve on that. Paul did a great job with what he had at that time. He used traditional T-bar tags, but there was some flaws in the study. His fish came from Rhode Island in the back of a truck, and they were all like 12 inches, and then they were thrown into in a controlled environment in a saltwater pond at Cat Cove Lab in Salem, which is funny because when I typed this in, I was like, holy crap, I think I'm one of the only people in the Gloucester facility that actually worked at Cat Cove one time. So that means I guess I'm getting a little old. I don't feel it, but that was embarrassing. And then so there was some flaws with that. What we're going to do is using this acoustic telemetry technology, we're going to be more inclusive of all different tackle types. We're going to be and conditions. We're going to be using not only circle, J, but we're going to be looking at artificials, single hook, soft plastics versus say poppers and swimming plugs with treble hooks. And we're going to do it in multiple areas and in multiple seasons. And already it seems promising with collaboration with a couple other people that have already expressed a lot of interest, specifically on the Connecticut Marine Fisheries Program and Dave Secor down at the University of Maryland. So that was quick, and but that's basically what we've been doing up in the last several months and last summer. Unfortunately, this final slide, I wish the intention was to have as much as DMF on here as possible. We were really hoping to have a lot of people out, especially collecting angler, different varying levels of angler experience, but with COVID, as you know, that was difficult. But there were a couple shout outs that really made this study a lot more fun and possible. Obviously, our fearless leader here, Mike Armstrong, he's a good manager and he's still a really good field biologist. Joe Holbash, again, I commented at the beginning of the talk, but he was really key to get the success of this. And then Sean Wallace, he was a guy that would, I'd text him the night before and he'd be there 4 a.m. every time. So with that, thank you, and any questions?